Welcome, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. He mihi nui kia, ki ngā tangata kua tai mai nei ki te ako, ki te whakarongo, ki te kōrero nei, ki te tautoko, te kaupapa o te rā nei. He mihi miharo ki ngā kai kōrero, Naga, Golriz and Lida. Ko Beth Greener tēnei, ko ai te tūmaki o te kura o PEP kei te kuninga ki Pūrehu Roa. Nā tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. So my name is Beth Greener. I am the Head of School of People, Environment and Planning at Massey University, also a Professor of International Relations at Massey. It is my absolute privilege today to be asked to be chairing this session. So our session today, we have a panel on women's rights, globalization, and the case of Iran. And many of you will already be aware of the current situation that is unfolding, has been unfolding in and across Iran, particularly since the death of Mahsa Amini at the hands of the state's morality police. We are seeing widespread protests led by women typically. We've seen people killed, attacked, harassed. We have seen a number of children killed in the violence. And I think the bravery of those standing up and calling for women, life and freedom at this point in time is unparalleled. So the spirit of this panel is in part to draw attention, I think, to the situation that's unfolding or has unfolded, and also to offer a form of support to those currently involved in the situation. So again, this morning we had some, I'm sure this will come into the conversation, but there have been yet more news stories coming forward about additional executions and also the targeting of women in particular ways by the state police. So we're very lucky today to have with us some very learned people and also very engaging speakers, which always helps when we're trying to understand a topic at hand. So our speakers today in order, so we'll be having three main speakers today, and I'll do a brief roundup at the end. We have our Green Party's Member of Parliament, Golriz Ghahraman, who is an Iranian Kiwi refugee with a background in international human rights law. We have Dr. Lida Ayubi, a senior lecturer in law at the Auckland University of Technology, specialising in human rights law and public international law. And we have Dr. Nagar Pato, senior lecturer at Massey University, whose expertise lies in the field of human security, gender equality, and Middle East politics as well. Each speaker is going to talk for approximately 10 minutes on different aspects of today's topic. And that topic again is women's rights, globalization, and the case of Iran. And at the conclusion of the three presentations, I'll briefly respond to some of that discussion, and then we'll open the floor to questions from the audience. Again, during the session, we ask that you be muted, but you're welcome to write questions in the chat during the conversation, and we'll come to those and I will chair that question and answer session. So I will be selecting the questions and drawing speakers' attention to those in the chat at that point in time. We have until 1 p.m. today, and I'm sure all of you, like me, are really looking forward to learning a great deal more about this really important and contemporary topic. So thank you for joining me today. And without any further ado, I will pass over to our first speaker, Golriz, and ask her for her thoughts on the topic that we have today.
Inga mana, inga reo, inga karangatanga maha tēnā koutou katoa. It's an absolute honour to be on this very learned panel as a politician rather than an academic. But so I thought, and in sort of collaborating before the panel, we thought that what might be of use for me to cover is the context of New Zealand's domestic obligations and our legal framework. But before I begin to touch upon that, I do want to ground us in what is at stake in Iran and the human element of that, and to just acknowledge that on this panel, and I think in terms of who's viewing, I would say there are very direct victim survivors of that regime. Every Iranian has had a very close experience of what that violence looks like, whether we've been arrested, raided, flogged personally, or someone close to us. And I was lucky enough to get out when I was 9 years old. So when I speak as New Zealand's, so-called first refugee MP, the story begins in Iran. It begins with my parents having been in what is now known as one of the biggest popular revolutions in modern history, which was the Iranian Revolution. And now the revolution that we're seeing is sort of the grandchild of that. But we lived through the years of this regime showing its brutal face, and that kind of terror of leaving the house in Iran as a woman, as even a child, is with me. And I left when I was 9. So this is something that we do have to hold. It's been systematic. It's been widespread. It has touched the lives of real people, women who had ambitions of being academics or being politicians, being lawyers and doctors, and Iranian women have persisted this whole time. They've existed in public life. They've been educated. They are the majority of university graduates in Iran, but still living in that context of you can be arrested, you can be disappeared, you can be raped and flogged and killed for the way you're dressed for 43 years. And acknowledging that it has been men as well. So with the execution of Mohsen Shekar just in the last days, a 23-year-old protester, someone who was prominent, a 23-year-old young man standing with this women-led revolution, but for democracy and for equality and for freedom. So this is a generation of Iranians absolutely fighting for breath. So that's what we're talking about. And that's actually why domestic and international law exists, to protect civilian populations against the brutality of regimes. And I do come at this as well as a lawyer. And so when I think about our responsibilities and the legal definitions of things like the Crimes of Torture Act, which I do want to touch on, or the terror designation for the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. It's with those, with the aspiration of having human rights law be enforceable, and for us as a global citizen to set good examples of how domestically we are responsible for upholding international rule of law. Something that's really interesting to me in that domestic context is that we see things like this happen all the time. We've had a coup in Myanmar. We saw the Hong Kong protests. We getting further away from protest violence. We have the Uyghur situation in China, where interchangeably we call it crimes against humanity or genocide. But one of the things that's really been very interesting in terms of domestic politics and where the Iran situation can go in New Zealand is that the protests that are happening right now have turned into a very global movement of diaspora Iranians rising up to amplify those voices. So it has become, apart from the legal responsibility of governments to act when big atrocity crimes are being committed, is that Iranians have actually, I think for the first time, really across the so-called free world, risen up to be part of this movement and to pressure our governments elsewhere in the world to do something. And so we've seen responses from New Zealand's allies, so-called allies, security partners, trading partners, that have been really, really strong and that have been responsive to there being an actual parallel movement in their own country. So across the EU, you know, we've seen hundreds of thousands of people rising up, Iranians organizing protests, getting allies along with them. We've seen that in Canada, and the United States, and in New Zealand and Australia. So I think it adds a really interesting political context here, where we have opposition parties criticizing the government for inaction. We've seen the government be questioned by media almost daily every time there's a protest here. And that's what's happening around the world. So it's not just in Iran, it's Iranians, and that idea of us also being victim survivors wherever we've ended up, and our displacement being part of that violence, but now it's coming back to haunt the regime. And so I think that's an important political context that we should hold as part of this panel, because we're going to keep going and keep bringing these actions, right? That's how we're going to get this thing done. But just to kind of come back to what we have to work with legally in New Zealand, I have joined the call for designating the Iranian Revolutionary Guard as a terrorist entity, and made that sort of my top call, because we're coming towards the end of the year. We've got very little legislative days left in Parliament, and New Zealand doesn't have an autonomous sanctions law. So we would have to, other than designating these guys a terrorist entity in order to take action, we only have that legislative route, and that would take too long. And it's not going to happen this year at this point. The terror designation is a quick response that we could make, and it would have both a real impact and a global political impact in my estimation. So the reason those two things sit alongside each other is that we want to talk about accountability. We want to talk about pressure that's real on the real individual perpetrators of the violence against women in Iran, against political opponents, against minorities, but also in terms of this protest itself, to say that we will respond every time you're violent right now against these revolutionaries, and to try and stop the atrocity that's happening right now. We know who they are. We know the political leaders in Iran that are responsible. We know more or less the leaders of the Revolutionary Guard in terms of the regional heads, the national head, and other leaders within that. So in terms of international law and talking about the responsibility to investigate, prosecute, and punish, we have more or less a list of names of those most responsible. But without that kind of access to the prosecutorial aspect of international law, we can say, well, you can't travel here. You can't travel. The EU has said they can't travel there, in the US and Canada and the UK. You can't hold money in our banks. You can't have investments here. You can't, if you are a New Zealander or another entity based in New Zealand, you can't fund these guys. You can't hold funds for them. You can't allow the perpetration of these crimes to go with impunity and with profit. So we know that atrocity crimes don't happen without profit. They don't. Wars don't happen without profit. There is an industry. And Iran is an incredibly wealthy nation. These are incredibly wealthy people. So the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, who is most responsible for these executions that we see happening, for executions that we've seen for 43 years, we know that the 1989 mass execution has now been defined as a crime against humanity. There are mass graves in Iran. That has gone on with impunity, even though it is defined as an international crime. that gives rise to individual criminal responsibility. But in terms of diplomacy, the terror designation would at least freeze these guys in place, because they can't keep raising funds. They can't keep doing this at a profit. And it will stop them because it will hit them where it hurts. The designation in New Zealand comes pursuant to the Terrorism Suppression Act. So Section 22 is a permanent designation. Section 21 is a temporary one that has to be reassessed. And Section 5 is the definition of the acts. So the reason I would call for a permanent designation is you know, obvious it can at any time. If things change, or if the entity ceases to exist, obviously that doesn't have to apply. But I think the temporary designation, we've kind of, that ship has sailed. This entity, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, has always existed as a terror entity. It exists outside of the military, the normal, every state has a military or police force apparatus of Iran. So it has only ever had the purpose of perpetrating terror. Otherwise, we'd just use the military, right? Or the ordinary police. Those entities operate within law. This one doesn't. It's always had just one purpose. So it fits within that permanent designation, just as ISIS does. There's no wing of this that's civilian and not aimed at terror. There's no wing of this that's governed by ordinary law. There's no transparency. I would include the revolutionary courts, because I have a deep belief that if you're calling something a court, but it's perpetrating extrajudicial killings, that the mullahs that sit as judges there are also involved in the terror that's being reaped. So that section is governed by, it can be police or the SIS, but there is a discretion of the New Zealand Prime Minister to designate an entity, a terror entity, if she, on reasonable grounds, so that's an objective standard, believes them to have committed acts that are defined in the Terrorism Suppression Act as terrorist acts. Terrorist acts have to be committed with the purpose of intimidating a population or scaring them, and they can include various acts, but the one I think we can very quickly tick off is causing the death or causing serious bodily harm to any person. So that's what they do. So we know that the intimidation, the aim of intimidation is very clear. We all across Iran feel intimidated by the Revolutionary Guard. The aim is to keep people oppressed, to keep political uprising suppressed, political dissent. I won't even use uprising. And they very regularly beat, rape, kill, flog, and disappear people. I can go into the types of things that happen in Iran, but one of the things that, I can't stress this enough, we all know someone who's gone into Evin prison or the like. They regularly arrest children and execute children. But one of the things that people do ask me about is the forced marriages. And I mean, we all know they send back a dowry to let you know that your daughter has been executed. And that means she's been sexually assaulted. The dowry is to say she was married before she was executed, so that the perpetrator doesn't go to hell. This is the level of violence we're living with. It is widespread and systematic, which to me is a crime against humanity. And so it has that higher level of responsibility for us as a nation to act. But the terror designation is sort of the least we can do. When Canada did it, they individually named just over 10,000 people. That's how known these people are. And they have funds outside of Iran. So we are at a risk of becoming a sanctuary for bank accounts, for funding mechanisms, and for security if we don't act now. And I would say that we're also at a risk of becoming an outlier within our security and ally group. I also just want to, I think I've gone to 10 minutes, right? So I just want to very briefly say that the New Zealand Crimes of Torture Act has extraterritorial jurisdiction. So if there is anyone here who has been involved in a crime of torture that includes aiding, abetting, encouraging, in terms of having been a member of the Revolutionary Guard, but having come here to study, to work for the embassy, for example, we actually have jurisdiction to arrest them and put them on trial for torture or being party to torture. So that's the other little one that I want to touch on. If anyone wants to bring that to the Solicitor General and go knocking on those doors, that's the other thing we have. All of this depends on a political voice and pressure being on our government, on the government knowing that New Zealanders know that standing with Iran, taking real action to protect these young, incredible people out on the streets is something that New Zealanders want. It accords with our values. So turning up, keep turning up, is essential here. It is the political tool.
Thank you so much for that impassioned and very compelling discussion, Golriz. I think that idea of being on the right side of history is something that we should be mindful of as we're trying to respond. Thank you. I'll ask our leader to take us into the next session.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you, Beth, and thank you, Golriz. Thank you, Nagar, for organizing this. I know you've been very busy in writing and your advocacy, so we're thankful. So I'd like to acknowledge Mohsen Shekari. Golriz briefly talked about him. So he is the first victim of the executions that the activists, people inside of Iran, have been warning us for months now. Some of you might be familiar with the wave of the so-called fact-checking that a lot of Western media did on the threat of executions facing nearly 15,000 individuals. Unfortunately, there was a bit of sort of miscommunication. Things got lost in translation there, and many sort of jumped to report that no, 15,000 protesters have not been sentenced to death. Which was not the point of what, again, the activists and people from inside of Iran were trying to communicate, was that it is a very real threat to these protesters. And we are seeing now the results of that and the result of the inaction in that. The first victim of that, again, was Mohsen Shekari, 23-year-old male who was arrested on a suspicion of sort of the claim that he had blocked the street and had engaged what I think can only really fairly be described as self-defense. So he had used a blade, but when you are facing hundreds of armed regime thugs, in essence, and you're trying to protect your own life and the lives of other unarmed, innocent protesters exercising their human right to peacefully protest, then I think, again, that can only be described as self-defense. So it's not even a crime that would normally be punishable by death in Iran. So Iran has ratified the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is a bit of a joke, obviously, at the moment. But the death penalty has not been abolished, but it is served for sort of the most serious crimes, such as first-degree murder or the crime of Moharabeh, which is waging war against the god, basically. And again, even by the regime's legal standards, this was a summary execution. He was sentenced to death in one court session, no access to a sort of his own lawyer. There was a self-appointed lawyer, which the legal community in Iran has started raising the alarms on that since the start of the protests, that these are not independent lawyers. These are not lawyers that have the best interests of the detainees at heart. And his appeal, because cases of the death penalty have to be appealed by basically the equivalent of the Supreme Court in Iran, and the appeal was still waiting to be heard, and the family were waiting to receive the outcome of that. And the news came that he had in fact been executed, and others have been convicted now, other protesters who've been arrested since the uprising broke out. So I won't talk too much about all the different human rights violations. I think we're all pretty much familiar with that. The point I do want to emphasize, though, is that just when we use words like human rights violations, we should be careful of the context we're using that in. So when we talk about human rights violations in New Zealand, we're talking about probably sort of the government not having done its best, or the distribution of resources, for instance, for the realization of economic, social, and cultural rights, or whether the help that we're providing to our students with disabilities in terms of the right to education is sufficient or not. But we call that a human rights violation. We call it a violation of the right to equality or the right to education. But what we're witnessing the regime do at the moment, what it's been doing for the past 43 years, but especially recently, it's that it's committing these violations and it's using them as a tactic for intimidating protesters, for cracking down. So the violation of the right to life, the violation of the right to liberty, the violation of the right to freedom of peaceful assembly, the violation against the rights of women in terms of the rapes and sexual assaults and so on. Again, these are not just things that are happening because someone did their job wrong or not enough time was spent to assess the situation. These are, the regime is using all these different violations, again, as a tactic to get rid of a lot of people, but also to intimidate others. It's very much so the consensus is that this sort of very hastened execution of Mohsen Shekari is to gauge the response, both in Iran and overseas. Are people going to pour into the streets? Is the international community going to, again, react very strongly? How much is it going to cost the regime? The regime is very much, has always done that, is engaging in a cost-benefit analysis of what is the cost of executing hundreds of protesters? Can we go ahead with it, or should we stop and try to sort of pursue other avenues? So I just wanted to really drive that point home regarding the human rights violations that are happening in Iran. And Negara asked me to talk about sort of how does this relate to New Zealand? Why should we care? Why do we keep asking the New Zealand government to take action? And I wanted to highlight, again, I think it goes without saying that any democratic country, any country that claims to care about human rights should be reacting to what's happening in Iran. We should have been reacting way sooner. But again, I just wanted to highlight a few points. And that's the fact that New Zealand has this perception, when you talk to our politicians, when you talk to MFAT employees, when you talk to our negotiators, our sort of former judges who've been on the International Court of Justice and International Criminal Court and all of that, we have this perception that we are a leader in terms of international human rights law. And outside of Aotearoa, there is also this perception that New Zealand is a democratic country. We lead in terms of human rights. We were very involved with the forming of the UN Charter. New Zealand has been also very involved with the adoption of most of the human rights treaties. Some of them, more or less, we could call ourselves the founding fathers, or for instance, with the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the chair of the committee that drafted the resolution that became the convention was a New Zealander. We have ratified the majority of the core human rights instruments and their optional protocols, which is also really important because when the UN declaration was being negotiated and drafted at the UN, one of the sort of key concerns for the New Zealand mission was the enforceability of rights, whether these rights that we're putting in an instrument are going to be enforceable. And of course, the declaration wasn't, and a lot of treaties on their own are either not fully enforceable or the enforcement is weak. And we have tried to supplement that by way of adopting optional protocols that create treaty bodies that can monitor states' compliance and where individuals can take their complaints once they've exhausted domestic remedies and have not reached a satisfactory outcome. And so again, just to emphasize that New Zealand has ratified, with the exception of a few, New Zealand has ratified most of these treaties and their optional protocols, giving that extra force to the treaty. We express, again, our politicians, our negotiators express their commitments to the multilateralism of the UN and to the rule of law. The Prime Minister earlier this year, when she was doing her world tour, gave a speech in Australia, again, emphasizing the commitment to multilateralism when the concept itself is very much under threat because of what's happening with the war in Russia and Ukraine. We were, if I'm not wrong, the second or possibly the third country that intervened in the case against Russia that's currently at the International Court. So we are not afraid of taking action when we want to take action. Our size doesn't stop us. I think that's quite important, again, just to we're not in Europe. We don't even have, that's prior to the conflict, we didn't even have a very strong connection with Ukraine, but that didn't stop us from, again, intervening in the case that relates to the crime of genocide. So I don't think there is any kind of ideological or precedent reason to stop New Zealand from taking action with regards to what's happening in Iran on the international level, but also domestically. I also, I went and had a look at sort of my notes that I had prepared for my human rights class this year, and I thought I'd share with you this as well. I hadn't even thought about it myself for a while, but I think it's quite significant that when we adopted our current International Human Rights Action Plan, so New Zealand's International Human Rights Action Plan, one of the two of the four key sort of objectives that we said we want to be global leaders on this. So the action plan, that's my 10 minutes, but I've got a bit more to say. So we have four sort of areas that we set out to become or continue to be global leaders on. And one of those is on gender equality and empowering women. And the other one, funny enough, is on the death penalty. So New Zealand's attempt to encourage more countries to abolish the death penalty or respond to violations that are going on as the result of countries not having abolished the death penalty. So I think that just that alone should give us the push, the incentive to act. And even more so now, just today, again, with this very imminent threat of extrajudicial killings of these protesters. We have been taking action. So for instance, on the special session of the UN Human Rights Council that happened last month, as it was called by civil society and was supported by a number of countries, New Zealand spoke as an observer state. We are not currently a Human Rights Council member state, so that was quite significant. New Zealand spoke in support of the draft, the resolution that established a fact-finding mission to investigate all the violations that have been happening since the death of Mahsa Amini. And I just want to link back to something Gulriz said with regards to New Zealand having universal jurisdiction with regards to the crime of torture. So that is extremely significant. So these are steps that might not seem really important when they happen. So, okay, well, we said something at the UN and there was a resolution, so what? But again, that just goes towards establishing this fact-finding mission who's going to document and preserve all these instances of violations, including torture. And so that would then later provide the basis for using this universal jurisdiction if a case of that were to arise in New Zealand. And again, as Gulriz said, once this movement is successful, I won't say if, I think it's just a matter of time. Once this is successful, there will be perpetrators everywhere, potentially including New Zealand. So that would give us, again, the basis for doing that. The Prime Minister has also spoken in support of expelling Iran from the UN Commission on the Status of Women. The vote on that is happening next week. So again, New Zealand is not on the commission at the moment, but New Zealand is a member of the ECOSOC, the UN Economic and Social Council, that appoints the members of the Commission. So New Zealand would be voting on whether or not Iran should stay on the Commission. I think it's fair to say, even though the voting is secret, I think it's fair to say we know what the vote would be. But I'll just finish with something maybe a little out there. And that's the fact that another country was suspended from UN membership in the 70s. And I think we all know what that country was. So South Africa was suspended from participating in the UN for 20 years. And why not Iran? I mean, what did South Africa do that Iran has not done? Or say, if ISIS were to apply for membership, how would that go? So why aren't we thinking a bit outside of the box? Or why aren't we willing to take further step or go a bit further? So these are great steps with the Human Rights Council, with the expelling of Iran from the Commission. But there is a lot that can be done, and there is, and these are things again that there is precedent for them. There is also a lot else that can be done if politicians and lawyers and negotiators get a bit creative. So I'll just end with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lida. Just so that people know too, we currently have 2 questions in the chat, but I also have another 2 via direct message. There's now 3. So just in terms of the interest of time, that's partly why I'll kind of quickly, I mean, obviously we can read them, but relay them, make sure the speakers can get through them in time. Thank you so much, Lida, for that conversation. I think it's quite important to remind people that it's been quite a long-standing theme in New Zealand foreign policy, this idea that we kind of have human rights as a kind of key cornerstone of foreign policy. We talked about a moral foreign policy all the way through from the 1930s, and also the current emphasis on the rule of law, saying we need this international rules-based order, and that's based on those kinds of principles, I think is really important. So thank you. So Nega, we'll have you next, and then I'll briefly sum up before we move into the questions.
Kia ora, thank you, Beth. I also think we can have a little bit of extra time to questions and answers, because I really enjoyed listening to all of them and listening about what, not only about the Iran's case and what can we do, but actually listening about how New Zealand government functions, what are how do we operate within the United Nations system. So it's very, very educational for me as well. But I just thought that I would start talking from a different angle, and that's the angle of human security and civil society. So my prior panelists talked to you about our obligations legally and our international obligations, but there is also a very strong history of social activism and having this moral campus in Aotearoa, New Zealand, collectively. So a lot of changes that we have had legally have always been happening bottom up. It is from the pressure of civil society on one way or another, whether it was the Waitangi Tribunal, the Springbok Tour. There is quite a lot of discussions and debates that make government to take another position. Now, we are talking about a situation which targets women particularly. Doesn't mean that men are not targeted. And in fact, I believe all my colleagues who work in feminism understand that men are also victim of patriarchy. Patriarchy is not something that just separates only gender, but it also separates different classes and systems. So when I'm talking about this woman-led, I am not specifically excluding men. I think it is very important to exclude them in all the processes. But I wanted to share with you just couple of very quick examples. So when I started talking to different civil society groups, and I'm hoping that if we do have any civil society organization listening to us today, I'm hoping that they do give us some kind of a statement of solidarity or kind of acknowledge their engagement and talk to us about it. Having a korero about these things are very important. It helps us, makes us confident. But a lot of these things happen from bottom up. So that part is that we need to understand. I have had the privilege to speak with a lot of my Kiwi friends and colleagues and larger society. It amazes me that how much of these stories, these horrible stories we hear, this violence-based models against women make other people nod in their head. Like women understand these kind of gender-based apartheid situation that has happened. They understand the significant problems of poverty. But I wanted to mention a couple of other things that actually we have commonality in the civil society structures and contexts. So the first thing that is very fascinating to me is that how the Islamic Republic has used the issue of economic in order to create poverty and forced prostitution on women. So as you know, one of the very, very major frustration points for women in Iran, which actually talks about, is very much connected with this discourse of hijab and multiple wives and the rest, is that they believe that the significant gender apartheid regime that the Islamic Republic has created, in addition with all of those misogynistic policies, will completely take away employment opportunities from women, take away any form of, even when they are very educated, they can't compete. I also should say that many men who do not adhere to the rules and regulations of Islamic Republic do not get a job and they have employment problems. But for women, these are constitutional issues. So you can't be a president, you can't be a jurisprudential leader, you can't be a judge, you can't have any important decision-making position in the Islamic Republic. You can't be the head of the parliament if you're a woman, and these are constitutional laws. So that part is completely take women out of decision making. But what they do in addition is that they create a facade system that brings economic pressure so much on women that it actually creates forced prostitution. So a lot of women in Iran who are uprising against this, it's not only because of the problems of civil liberty, but also because of the endemic and very problematic corruption and economic pressure on women that actually sometimes put them in prostitutions. And we know that this is not only exclusive to Iran. We know that when the Me Too campaign started to go ahead, a lot of times these discussions were a part of the campaign, that it's not only about domestic violence, and it is in that level that a lot of us understand the problems that we do. Plus, that I believe in New Zealand, we do have many people who come from different parts of the world, many women facing the similar issues and problems. Now, what is interesting to me is that when I was reading a book about the workers in the meat work industry in United States in the 1970s, and they had in 1960s, and they had two different unions. They had a black union and they had a white union, and then they both were competing. So they did have different agenda, but they were both competing for better labor opportunities. And one of them really decided to say that, yes, okay, we have different ethnic groups and we have different colors and we have different ideas, but we do have some goals. And these goals are united between us. So he did a lot of emphasis in uniting these two different unions. And since 1967, when they got united, they could achieve a lot more. And I believe participation in this discourse and dialogue for us in Atara, it's not only something altruistic that we can actually do that, but it allows us to see how we can address the problems we are dealing with in New Zealand quite significantly when it comes, for example, to domestic violence, particularly violence against women, how we can target it. So I think that's one. And the last point that I want to mention is that I have been looking at what have Iranian community been doing around New Zealand, Atara in the last 2 months, and I have been thinking about this is a recipe for civil society movement. This is going to be one of the interesting moments of history. And this will actually could help women, could help a lot of different ethnic communities, a lot of different groups who want to start a civil society movement, to say how we can start it, how we can put pressure on different civil society, different governments, apparatus, how we can create these discourses. So to me, the discourses of Iran, they're taking an action. It's definitely a part of the responsibilities as a government. It's definitely a part of our responsibility as a global citizen in the terms of government being a global citizen, but also it is individually as a part of us, is that civil society, it gives us a moral campus. Beth mentioned something about standing in the rights of the history. And I wanted to say this happened to us when we were taking a stand against Rwanda's genocide. We pushed it in the United Nations Security Council. We lobbied for it. We went again and again and said, look, we are in New Zealand. We can see this happening. It actually, we pushed quite a lot. Now, in 2015, when we were campaigning again to be a part of the United Nations Security Council, part of the records we have is that many of the countries remember us as standing in the right side of the party, and they actually gave us the credibility and the trust. If we, as a small island in the international community, want to operate, these are the amazing assets, and these are the amazing traits points that we have, is our credibility, our standing for human rights, both at the level of government, but also at the level of people. So I finished my talk here, and I really look forward for a discussion. Thank you, Beth, for chairing it. Thank you, Godrese, for coming to the event. It was lovely. And thank you, Lida. I know you, like me, is doing all the work as well. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Nagar. And I just want to make sure too that people know, although I'm chairing, it's been very much a labour of love for Nagar, who organised this event, as far as I'm aware. Correct me if I'm wrong there, Nagar, but I'm just literally being privileged to have the chair for the day without having done any of the organising, which is one of the best ways to do it. I think just to kind of finish off, so I think we've had some really important discussions this morning in terms of both a very engaging, that's not meant to, in terms of the sense that, Godrese, I think you made us feel some of the experiences of people around the world, here in New Zealand as well as in Iran, in terms of relaying your own personal experience and indicating how even though you were 9, that this has left such an indelible impression upon you, and Lida too, thinking about all of the different options that New Zealand, we've pursued this human rights champion mantle, and there are various ways in which we can continue to do that. Nagar too, also, I think a reminder about civil society, that individual people can make a difference, that even if the New Zealand government chooses not to pursue a certain course of action, that it's people and groups and interests that bring people together that can affect change. So even though if the government doesn't decide to take certain courses of action, people can still nonetheless lobby for it, draw attention to it, and put in individual effort that way. I think the other thing, the things which I just wanted to kind of end up with is, I'm somebody who works in the field of international relations more broadly, and also has an interest in gender politics and feminism. And it's a little bit overhashed, but that the famous quote from Audre Lorde, I think, always maintains some kind of relevance in situations like this, where she said that I'm not free while any woman is unfree, even when her shackles are very different from my own. And I think that's quite, in New Zealand, yes, we tend to be in the top 10 gender equal countries in the world, but nonetheless have the worst domestic violence statistics in the OECD. We still have high rates of what we call femphobia. So young men particularly deciding that anything feminine is seen to be a negative and something that they should try and diminish within themselves at their own cost, often in terms of their mental health or their ability to engage with emotion. So it's something which I think, and there's no country in the world which is gender equal. So it's something which is of relevance to everybody, men and women. And I also really appreciated, Godrese, drawing attention to the fact that it's everybody's issue. It's not just a women's issue, although women are leading some of the protests. It's everybody's issue. And also that connection between the international and the domestic. So some of the choices that you have as a state, or some of the options that you have been outlined today, one of those being potentially listing the Revolutionary Guard on the terrorist group list, which I think is, there's precedent already in terms of other countries having done so. And it might take I think one of the issues is it takes a little while to get our head around that, because often we associate this concept of terrorism with non-state groupings. And yet here is a state organized institution. But as you say, it's not like the usual military kind of concept. So we have a bit of a discombobulation there, I think, in terms of what is this organisation. For those of us in New Zealand, it's hard to understand the role of that institution, because, you know, our civil military relation is nothing like that particular situation. So I think just raising an awareness and understanding about what the fact that there's a very particular ethos and intent. And so I think the issue about the that you mentioned in terms of that human rights violations, so I think this was Leah, human rights violations are now, they're intentional. They're being undertaken with the purpose of intimidation, and they're strategic in terms of diminishing resistance to the regime at the moment. So trying to get our head around that, I think, is really helpful for you to have laid that out. Also, that idea that we could become a sanctuary for bad practices, bad things. We don't want that. That's certainly something I think the New Zealand public would be quite allergic to. And also, I guess one of the last things which I think is really important is that I came across a phrase when I was kind of looking through material to do with this, that people who have power don't dream about, or don't daydream about, empowerment. You know, those who don't need to think about these sorts of things may not do so unless it's put in front of them or they're brought face to face with it. So I really appreciate all three speakers coming today to share both their experiences and their suggestions for change. As I said, there are a couple of options. So I think Golriz is putting the organisation on a terrorist group list. Once we understand why, I think that provides some impetus to and some rationale for that. One of the other issues that's been raised is the expulsion of the ambassador. That's a really interesting one in New Zealand's case, because we're quite allergic to doing that in New Zealand. We didn't even expel the French at the time of the Rainbow Warrior bombing, and some of the rationales that are given around that are the importance of maintaining some form of communication. But at the same time, then if we were to do so, that would be incredibly symbolic. So I think that's also an interesting question. Okay, I'm going to finish up there. We have some really great questions in the chat. So a couple of them have come through to direct message for me. So what I might do is I will, again, if people have a little bit more time, we can probably be cheeky and push out. Golriz and Leah, did you have any time constraints? Just checking, because Nagar suggests she doesn't.
I can go to about 10 past, I think.
Okay.
So it's quite a bit
So
more.
let's aim for that then. So Nagar, did you want to stop recording at this stage?
Yeah.
So if we go to the first question,